In the autumn of 1891, when the English countryside had already surrendered its fields to mist by late afternoon, and respectable families still believed that silence was the surest way to preserve dignity, Eleanor Gale returned to Blackmere House. She had not seen it in 12 years. From a distance, it appeared less like a residence than a memory that had refused to die. It stood beyond the village chapel on a low rise of earth, all steep gables, dark stone, and narrow windows sunk so deeply into the walls that they resembled watchful eyes. Ivy had claimed the eastern face, rain had blackened the roof. The chapel beside it leaned with the tired humility of a servant who had spent too long in proximity to wealth and secrets. Eleanor arrived there at the request of her dying father. That, at least, was the formal reason. The truer reason was that there are summonses which do not come from the living so much as from the unfinished arrangements they leave behind. Her father had written only once after years of distance, asking that she return before the first frost and take possession of the house as the last of the Gale line. He had added, in a hand weakened by illness, that certain rooms must remain exactly as they were found, and that above all, she was never to enter the chamber over the chapel after nightfall. Eleanor was 31, unmarried, disciplined, and burdened with the kind of intelligence that had kept her from superstition without sparing her from dread. Since leaving Blackmere in her youth, she had earned a modest living in Bath as a companion and copyist, moving quietly through the edges of other people's homes. She did not romanticize the past. She remembered too well what it had felt like to grow within those walls under a father whose religion was discipline and whose tenderness, if it existed at all, had been directed chiefly toward the dead. She also remembered her mother, though only in fragments. A pale hand closing a piano lid, a hymn half sung in the chapel, a scent of lavender, and once, very late, the sound of weeping somewhere overhead, though no servant would ever admit to hearing it. Her father died on the second evening after her arrival. He left little behind him but keys, ledgers, a Bible swollen with annotations, and an estate too diminished to inspire envy. The servants, reduced now to an old housekeeper and a gardener with failing lungs, moved through their duties like people long accustomed to withholding opinions. When Eleanor asked after the room above the chapel, the housekeeper crossed herself in the older country manner and said only that some doors were closed because the family had paid dearly to keep them so. Such answers have a way of inviting the very curiosity they are meant to suppress. The room stood at the end of a narrow upper passage connecting the main house to the chapel roof. Its door was made of darker wood than the others, and the key her father had left for it hung alone on a separate ring, as if even in storage it required moral quarantine. Eleanor examined the lock on her third day, then her fourth. By the fifth, she had already begun to imagine the chamber in such detail that entering it seemed less like disobedience than correction. She waited until morning. Inside, she found no monster, no shrine, no lunatic relic of ancestral barbarity. The chamber was spare and almost monastic. A narrow bed, a washstand, a writing desk, a prie-dieu facing the chapel wall, heavy curtains stitched with tiny black flowers, and on every visible surface, beneath years of dust, the same repeated mark. 3 fine lines scratched into wood, stone, and brass, as though by a patient fingernail. On the desk lay a journal bound in faded green leather. It belonged to her mother. Eleanor sat down at once and opened it. The earliest pages were gentle enough. Household notes, weather, parish visits,
reflections upon marriage written with the graceful vagueness of a woman determined to make peace with disappointment by refusing to name it. But as the entries advanced, the tone altered. Her mother began writing of sounds in the night, soft steps upon the passage, the dragging of fabric, a hand trying the locked door without impatience, as though it knew time to be on its side. She wrote that Eleanor's father had forbidden discussion of the matter and insisted that the room above the chapel had belonged, before their marriage, to his elder sister Anne, who had died there in her 19th year after a period of spiritual agitation. This phrase, Eleanor noticed, had been underlined so violently the nib had nearly torn through the page. Further on, her mother recorded village talk that Anne Gale had not died from illness at all, but from confession. Some claimed she had seen something in the chapel grounds and thereafter refused to speak above a whisper.
Others said she had fallen in love beneath her station and had been locked away to recover her sense of duty. Others still, lowering their voices to the thrilling pitch reserved for old scandal, suggested that the sin had been within the house itself and that Anne had carried knowledge too dangerous for a respectable name to endure. Then came the first unmistakable line of terror. "My husband says the room is empty, yet something grieves in it after dark." Eleanor stopped reading and looked over her shoulder. The chamber was still. Beyond the wall, through old stone and chapel timber, she could hear only the faint ticking of rain. She told herself she had expected too much too quickly. Houses always grow stranger under inherited authority. A room forbidden in childhood rarely survives adulthood without gathering theater around itself. She took the journal to her own bedchamber and continued reading after sunset. That was her first mistake. The later pages were crowded, hurried, and no longer written by a woman trying to remain calm. Her mother described waking at night to find muddy droplets on the chapel steps, though no rain had fallen. She described hearing someone kneel at the prie-dieu in the room above, though the door remained locked and the key hidden. She described Eleanor's father, normally so severe in composure, standing once in the passage at dawn with blood on his cuff and no explanation prepared. Near the end, the journal ceased to speculate and began to accuse. Anne had not been mad. Anne had not been ill. Anne had loved a village schoolmaster, and when she discovered herself with child, the family decided the shame could not survive the season. The schoolmaster disappeared. Anne was confined. The village doctor was paid. The chapel bell was not rung on the day she died. Eleanor reached this passage with such force in her pulse that she nearly missed the final line written beneath it. "She walks because no one confessed." At that moment, a sound passed over the ceiling above Eleanor's room. Not a footstep, a slow, deliberate crossing, as though the weight that made it had all the time in the world and nowhere else to be. She rose at once, journal in hand, and opened her chamber door. The passage beyond was unlit. Blackmere House, like most old houses, had a darkness more textured than simple absence, as if the years themselves had thickened in the corners. Eleanor stood listening. For several seconds there was nothing. Then came 3 soft scratches from the direction of the chapel corridor. 3 lines. Again. Again. She ought to have woken the housekeeper. She ought to have rung for the gardener. She ought, if prudence had governed her, to have locked herself in and waited for daylight, like any sensible woman confronting the impossible. Instead, she took a candle and went toward the sound. The corridor to the chapel felt colder than the rest of the house. At its far end, the door to the room above the chapel stood open. Eleanor knew she had locked it that morning. Within, the curtains stirred, though the windows were latched. Her candlelight trembled across the bed, the desk, the black-stitched drapery, and finally the prie-dieu, where someone appeared to be kneeling with her back turned. The figure wore a pale dress the color of old bone. Its hair hung dark and damp against the cloth. Its shoulders moved not with breath, but with the slow, irregular motion of grief that has forgotten the body and gone on living by habit. Eleanor could not speak. The figure did not turn. Instead, it lifted one arm and pointed to the wall above the prie-dieu. There, half concealed by shadow, Eleanor saw words scratched into the plaster beneath generations of lime wash. Not for God, for them. Then the figure rose. When it turned, the face was not rotted, nor bloodied, nor transformed into any theatrical horror. It was simply young, ruined by sorrow, and intolerably familiar. The resemblance to family portraits in the lower hall was exact. Anne Gale stood before her not as a specter of vengeance, but as a fact that had been denied too long to remain buried. Its mouth opened. What came from it was not a scream, but the chapel bell tolling from inside a human throat. Eleanor dropped the candle. Darkness rushed upward. She fled the room and did not stop until she reached the main staircase, where she collided with the housekeeper, roused at last by the bell that now rang in the chapel below, though no human hand had touched the rope in 30 years. By dawn, the household knew only this. The bell had sounded through the night. The room above the chapel had been found open, and Eleanor Gale had ordered the family ledgers, parish records, and her mother's journal brought to the dining room fire. She did not burn them. She read them. All of them. Before noon, she had learned what generations of decorum had hidden. Payments to the doctor, dismissal money to the schoolmaster's brother, repairs billed for chapel stone at an hour when no repair should have been needed, and at last a folded letter in her father's hand, written but never sent, acknowledging that Anne had begged only to keep the child and leave the county, and that he, then still a young man desperate to preserve the Gale name, had helped silence her. He had called it necessity. He had called it mercy. He had called it the burden of protecting the family. Eleanor understood then what the house had become. Not haunted merely by death, but by the discipline of unconfessed sin. The room above the chapel was no prison for a ghost. It was a wound built into architecture. Each generation had inherited not only the property, but the obligation to remain silent. And the silence itself had become the thing that walked. That evening, with villagers gathered in anxious knots beyond the chapel gate, Eleanor ordered the bell rung in daylight for the first time since Anne's death. She had the parish vicar summoned. She opened the family records before him and before whoever else wished to hear. Then, standing beneath the bell tower with the mist climbing around the graves, she spoke Anne Vale's name aloud and told the truth of what had been done to her. No thunder answered. No heavens split. But as Eleanor finished, those nearest the house saw the upper window darken, though no curtain moved across it, and the corridor lamp visible through the chapel arch went gently out. Blackmere House did not become cheerful after that. Such houses never do. Stone keeps memory longer than flesh, and some crimes leave a flavor in the air no confession can entirely sweeten.
But the steps in the passage ceased. The 3 scratches never appeared again, and the room above the chapel, once open to daylight and emptied of its secrecy, became merely a room. Eleanor sold the estate that spring. She kept only her mother's journal and 1 brass key, though the lock it served was later removed. She married no one. She had no wish to found another house upon inherited silence. Instead, she lived plainly, and with enough truth to keep the dead from needing doors. For it is an old vanity among the respectable to imagine that sin can be contained by walls, by names, by sealed rooms and polished prayers. But what is hidden in the name of dignity does not disappear. It lingers, it waits, and if denied long enough, it learns to speak in colder voices than the living, until someone, usually too late, mistakes doom for fate and discovers that the thing haunting the house was never the dead girl at all, but the silence built around her. You just have crossed the door to the light beyond shadow,